Good. Okay. So you're all more than welcome here today to the first Irish Institute for Catholic Studies lecture of the autumn semester. We're delighted to welcome Maher, Dr. Maher here today, who's going to be talking on representations of Catholicism in some 21st century Irish women fiction writers. So Eamon is the director of the National Centre for Franco-Irish Studies, which is based on the Tallaght campus of TU Dublin. He's the author of 4 monographs and 25 edited or co-edited books. He is also general editor of 2 critically acclaimed academic book series with Peter Lang in Oxford, The Reimagining Ireland and Studies in Franco-Irish Relations. So his recent publications include, alongside with Brian Lucy and Eugene O'Brien, Reimagining the Celtic Tiger, and with Eugene O'Brien, Reimagining Irish Studies for the 21st Century, which was the special 100th volume in the Reimagining Ireland series. Eamon is an internationally renowned scholar of the work of John McGahern, on whom he has published 2 monographs, John McGahern from the Local to the Universal, and the Church and Inspire, John McGahern and the Catholic Question, and 1 collection alongside Derek Hand, essays on John McGahern, Assessing a Literary Legacy. He's also published one of only 2 monographs available on the French priest writer Jean Soulevant, I probably pronounced that wrong, Eamon, sorry, on whom he did his PhD research. Jean Soulevant, La Marginalité dans la vie et l'œuvre. He is currently writing a book on the Catholic novel. So, as my bad French, I suppose, will lead us into a wonderful lecture. So, thanks very much, and I'll hand you over to Eamon.
Thank you very much, Ian. I'm glad that the bio I wrote for you there, the glowing bio, was, that you managed to get it all in. No, I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to have been invited. Thanks to Trish and to Carly and Ian for setting this up. And thanks to everybody for taking out some time in the afternoon or the morning, depending on where you are, to tune in. Right, I get into it. So it might come as a surprise to many to discover that in an increasingly secular Ireland, Catholicism has not disappeared from the radar of our novelists. But then again, the whole concept of being branded a post-Catholic society does not mean that the majority religion no longer plays any worthwhile or significant role. Being post something logically infers an abiding link to what has come before. Gladys Gagnon offers the following assessment. Post-Catholic Ireland, then, she says, is paradoxical. The role of the Catholic Church has changed so dramatically that it is possible to identify a new era. But at the same time, Catholicism retains a different, yet still important influence on people's personal lives and in the public sphere. In the secular age, Charles Taylor argues that there are different interpretations of secularity, the fall-off of religious belief and practice, and a decreasing number of people manifesting a belief in God being just one. Another would be the emptying of religion from autonomous social spheres, especially the apparatus of the state, whereby legislation is no longer influenced to an appreciable degree by any formal church interference. The change that interests Taylor is one, quote, which takes us from a society in which it was virtually impossible not to believe in God, to one in which faith, even for the staunchest believer, is one human possibility among others. This latter model describes very well what has happened in the last few decades in Ireland. The argument I'll develop in this paper is that even if it merely serves as a comparator or something to rail against, Catholic identity remains an important preoccupation for contemporary writers, most of whom were brought up in the Catholic faith. One Irish novelist of the last century, John Broderick, 1924 to 1989, declared during an interview with RTE broadcaster David Hanley on the year of his death, anyone who is reared in a Catholic atmosphere first of all takes in that atmosphere more or less through their pores, an assertion that several Irish writers would acknowledge as corresponding to their own their own experience. Indeed, contemporary novelist Lisa McInerney, author of the critically acclaimed Cork trilogy, The Glorious Heresies, The Blood Miracles, and The Rules of Revelation, titles which all have significantly spiritual resonance, in an interview with Hedwig Schule, made the following comments in relation to Catholic culture in Ireland. It would be next to impossible to write an authentic Irish piece and not have some mention of religion in it, she noted, before adding, and you may still have the rituals of baptism, communion, confirmation, even though you never see the inside of a church up to that point. How do you write about Ireland and not about religion? The answer to that question is with great difficulty, in my view. McInerney emphasizes that the loss of faith or the failure to practice does not remove the cultural sediment, which continues to germinate and to influence how people behave and react to certain situations, particularly traumatic ones. How the topic of religion is treated in fiction will vary in accordance with the zeitgeist of the time. John McGahern had a very different upbringing to that of McInerney, or the women writers I deal with in this paper. He experienced firsthand a Catholic Church whose authority was rarely challenged, and which guarded its power jealously. McGahern fell foul of the Church when his second novel, The Dark, was banned in 1965 for containing material that had the potential to pose a threat to public morality. The book deals with the masturbatory habits of its male adolescent character, who was abused by his widowed father and with whom he shares a bed. This type of material was never going to please the Archbishop of Dublin at that time, John Charles McQuaid, who successfully intervened with the Irish National Teachers Organisation to have the writer removed from his teaching position. This was possible because of the Church's control of virtually all primary and secondary education in Ireland. The strange thing is that, in spite of suffering at the hands of the Catholic Church, McGahern remained attracted to its rituals and the sense of comfort they brought to him and to many others of his generation. When he died in 2006, his funeral in rural Leitrim was completely in keeping with local customs and practice. His cousin, Father Liam Kelly, said the Mass, and there were prayers said at the graveside. Seamus Heaney once observed that going to funerals is, quote, part of the ethic of respect that the Irish have for the dead. In relation to McGahern's Mass, he noted how appropriate it was that it should have been celebrated with a small congregation of family, neighbours and writers, and very few public figures. Heaney continued, and no Latin either, just the vernacular parish Mass, a low Mass as they used to call it, during which a tribute was spoken by the celebrant. No music, no addresses by friends or writers. The coffin carried down the aisle, the same as at the funeral last week and last year and last century. The rosary said at the graveside, and then local men shoveling in the mould. Clearly, Heaney was taken with McGahern's arrangements, as they were very similar to the Nobel laureate's own funeral in Balahy, County Derry, a few years later, which was an equally low-key affair. In the last few decades, the clerical abuse scandals and the revelations about the horrific treatment meted out to internees of the religious-run industrial schools and Magdalen laundries, both of which will feature in this paper, have led to a major collapse in people's trust in the institutional Catholic Church. In their revealing study, The Child Sex Scandal and Modern Irish Literature, Writing the Unspeakable, Joseph Vallant and Margot Bacchus underline how in the heyday of the Church's power after gaining independence from British rule in 1921, quote, children were conceived as empty vessels whose virtually coterminous spiritual and sexual purity was absolutely secured by the Church's social and moral oversight, a situation that contributed to the aforementioned abuses that took the best part of a century to expose. The Church's obsession with sexual purity was the main reason why writers who chose to delve into this topic found themselves outside the fold, treated like pariahs by church officials and members of the laity alike. We have already seen what happened to John Maher. Change was slow in coming, but when it started, it gained remarkable momentum. Within little more than a half a century of Maguire's sacking, Ireland would have one of the most liberal legislation regimes in Europe, as can be seen in the decriminalisation of homosexual acts between consenting adults, the legalisation of divorce, full access to contraception and limited access to abortion, and the introduction of same-sex marriage. At the same time, there has been a marked decline in the numbers attending Mass and the sacraments, a situation that was further exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis and by a severely depleted number of largely elderly priests ministering in parishes, all of which has combined to create a real crisis for Irish Catholicism. Irish Times journalist Derek Scannell, or Scally even, in his recent monograph ironically entitled The Best Catholics in the World, The Irish, the Church and the End of a Special Relationship, sums up the experience of many when he describes himself as, quote, a grappling Catholic, unsure of church doctrine and uneasy about its effect on my life, yet better able now to appreciate the beauty and see how many of the toxic elements I remember were as much Irish as Catholic. This reassessment of the role of Catholicism by Scally may well explain why Catholicism is still palpable in novels that are currently being published in Ireland. There is an acceptance that the Church was not responsible for all the country's ills, and that many of the problems were as much Irish as they were religious, which is not in any way an attempt to excuse the Church's appalling attempts to cover up the crimes perpetrated by some of the priests and religious, thus prolonging the suffering of thousands of abuse victims. I don't know how many of you were listening to the horrific revelations on the radio on Monday last of the Puritan fathers in Blackrock and what happened to two boys, their brothers in fact, and many others who had never even got their day in court, but it was all about preserving obviously the reputation and ultimately the money of the church, or with that order in particular. In an interview I conducted with the poet, playwright and fiction writer Dermot Bulger, he stated that he is not at all anti-Catholic. I quote, "The time to be an anti-Catholic was when it was unpopular to be so." Writers in general tend to be countercultural, which is what Bulger is hinting at here. He observes, growing up in Ireland in the 1960s, it was like you had these huge puppets of oppression or alleged oppression to whom you could take a baseball bat and smash them. Two of the puppets of oppression he is referring to were the Conservative leader of Fianna Fáil and future President of Ireland, Eamon de Valera, and the previously mentioned Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid. Both came to be associated with a Victorian type of Puritanism, which an increasingly better educated population was beginning to call into question. Several novels during the 1960s described young protagonists discarding the religious principles of their parents' generation in order to follow their sexual inclinations and live lives that were free from church interference. Edna O'Brien's Country Girl trilogy, along with works by Brian Moore, Kate O'Brien, Lee Dunn and John McGahern, fell into that category, and most of them were banned by the censorship board. Writing about taboo subjects like sex at that time could have serious consequences, in Ireland that is, and yet several novelists persisted in dealing with them simply because they are at the core of what it is to be human. With those few thoughts in mind, we will now consider some 21st century novels by women writers where Catholicism plays a significant role. We will see that certain tropes recur. The healing power of ritual, the search for the transcendent, the body as a site of sin, hypocrisy among certain representatives of Catholicism, the abuse inflicted on young people and kept silent under the protective shield of religion. Writers who depict certain features of Catholicism should not be apologists for that form of religious practice. Neither should they be severe critics of same. Good literature is never about didacticism. As Seamus Heaney once wrote, the poet serves language and not ideology. The novel has traditionally been concerned with producing a slice of life, une tranche de vie, with characters and context that are reflective of real human experience, and that is generally the case among accomplished writers. So the first novel I'll discuss is Anne Enright's Booker Prize-winning 2007 work, The Gathering, which I argue could only have been written by someone with a Catholic sensibility. The title denotes the focal point of the novel, which revolves around the suicide of the female protagonist Veronica's brother Liam, and the repatriation of his remains to Ireland for his wake, gathering of the title, and funeral. The narrative reveals the extent to which tragic events can revive past traumas and reveal secrets that may have laid dormant for many years. The 39-year-old Veronica was brought up in a family of 12 and was closest to Liam, an alcoholic who went to live in England and was fished out of the sea near Brighton after deciding that his life was no longer worth living. During the wake, a discussion begins as to what might have been the source of Liam's problems. Veronica knows his issues dated from the abuse to which he was subjected by Lam Nugent, a sinister character who controlled their grandmother Ada after the death of her husband Charlie, and who was a regular visitor to Ada's house. As a young girl, Veronica entered the good room, as it was known, in her grandmother's house, where she found her brother and Nugent engaged in a disturbing sexual act. On seeing her at the door, Nugent merely told her to leave, secure in the knowledge that she could never speak to anyone about what she had seen. After all, who at the time would have believed that a devout Catholic like Nugent could have been involved in such immoral activity? While grieving Liam's loss, Veronica remembers the terrified look on his face that day in the front room and feels guilty that she did nothing to save him. Needless to say, neither of them ever spoke of the event subsequently. Veronica reflects on why Nugent, who was having an affair with Ada and abusing her grandson, should have been free to conduct himself in the way he did. And here's a quote. He was at the Pro-Cathedral that morning for early Mass. He walked in a line with other men for Holy Communion. The look on their faces was as hungry as poor men queuing for soup. And when he got up from his knees, he did so like a decent man, slow in the haunches, heavy with the weight of his life on this earth, sad for the people he loved, brave. The reality could not have been more different, as is borne out by his private proclivities. Nugent is not the only one leading a double life either. Veronica thinks of how her own parents also engaged in a devout and unthinking observance of their Catholic duties. Of course, Mammy is a Catholic, in the way Mammies are. But for 14 years or so, I sat by or behind my father on a wooden church bench every Sunday morning, and in all that time, I never saw his lips move. I never heard him pray aloud, or even saw him bend his head, or do anything that might be considered remarkable, were he sitting on the top deck of a bus. Enright portrays Veronica's parents as representative of swathes of Irish people from a few decades ago who would never dream of missing Mass, but who often had nothing other than a superficial grasp of their faith. Religion was habitual for them, and they did not bother themselves with questioning the authenticity of their belief system. Veronica comes across as being dissatisfied with her life and demonstrates a conflicted attitude to sex, which may be the result of her having also been abused by Nugent and then occluding the memory. It was only when the revelations began to appear in the Irish media about what had happened in industrial schools, Magdalen laundries, mother and baby homes, or the findings of the various reports on clerical sex abuse, that Veronica came to see that others had suffered a similar fate to Liam. Looking at her brother's corpse and reflecting on what she knew of his life, she cannot help feeling responsible for what happened to him. Valent and Bacchus offer the following interpretation. The dissociation of her, Veronica's, childhood memories, enjoined by their traumatic force, serves as the novel's double synecdoche for the larger cultural amnesia concerning child abuse in Ireland, of which Veronica's specific state of PTSD, post-traumatic syndrome disorder, is but a part and an effect. I would add that the funeral ceremony, the waking of Liam's corpse in their mother's house, the shaking of hands of those who come to pay their respects, the mass and the burial, all combine to bring finality and dignity to Liam's life and healing to Veronica. The last lines of the novel read, I've been falling into my own life for months, and I'm about to hit it now. Seems as though her re-engagement with Catholicism has contributed to reopening certain wounds by forcing her to visit once more the trauma of her youth. This facing down of her past is essential to Veronica's rehabilitation. Interestingly, Eamon McBride's A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, published in 2013, also delves into the area of abuse and how it is silenced within a family context, where religious values still hold sway. The nameless female protagonist is born into a rather dysfunctional family. Her only sibling, a brother who is 3 years older, is diagnosed as having a terminal brain tumor from a young age, and is the one family member she is close to. Her disproportionately religious mother and maternal grandparents continually promote Christian values, especially sexual purity, and the grandparents regularly criticize her father, who absconded when she was very young. The crucial event in her life is the painful rape she endured as an adolescent from her uncle, after which she feels incapable of looking on her body as anything other than abject. The character's mental disorientation is clear as she goes from one meaningless sexual encounter to the next, allowing, and sometimes encouraging, men to inflict pain on her body. As she constantly worries about her brother's health, he dies towards the end of the novel, she finds there is no one to whom she can turn. Her uncle occasionally appears interested, but more often than not, this is merely as a means of initiating sex. Her grandfather sees himself as a moral guardian. Have you been saying your prayers? He asks. Going to communion? How often? And confession? Every week? You know it's important never to receive the host in a state of sin. Your body is a temple for Christ. Did they teach you that at school? It is the externals of religion that are emphasized here, attending Mass and receiving the sacraments, ensuring that the body is a temple for Christ. The grandfather also feels entitled to berate his daughter's choices. Too good to marry a man who'd want his children to believe in God. Oh, we look down our noses at those sorts, don't we? You've always looked down your nose at me and my beliefs. You're above that sort of thing. But I couldn't care less because I'm grateful for how God has worked in my life. The girl's mother, agitated by her father's sanctimonious comments, often takes out her frustration on the children when he leaves. She's very involved in the church, hosting prayer sessions in the house and warning her daughter of the dangers of alcohol and sex, with which the girl is already more than familiar. At times she experiences something akin to guilt. The sharp light, picking at my eyes, needle shafts of, what have I begun or ended? What I've done? Sex as, go to mass, confession, and I thought I would not this again. Is it the same as? Pebble under toe, think about, kick, not again, no, stop. The disjointed language and strange syntax indicate a mind that is in turmoil. A young woman who knows that she is on the path to self-destruction and wonders if religion could possibly assist her to regain control of her life. Shadia Abdel Rahman Al-Tellez argues that the girl, quote, perceives sexuality as something aberrant that goes against Christian morality. Menstruation, an important step on the road to becoming a woman, leads to her being transformed from a lamb to a half-formed thing, a phrase that denotes her, quote, objectivation and alienation derived from her own gender and the experience of sexual violence. Tellez concludes, because the girl is absorbed by a context in which female sexuality is tabooed and demonized, she interprets puberty as the cause of her conflicts with her embodied identity. Subsequent to the first rape, her problems with the body become intensified, and she seeks relief through having pain inflicted on her by her sexual partners. She asks her uncle to hit her, something that fills him with revulsion, but he does it anyway, and then they have sex. There are countless descriptions of rough sex with strangers, particularly when the girl is undergoing stress, like the time when her brother is dying. Quote, I am tired, too full of stuff I've done. Where my legs hurt, where my scalp hurts. I'll not fight the thing inside me anymore. Let it eat me up. Please God, I want it to. Unlike Veronica in The Gathering, the girl continues on a downward spiral, which ends with her walking into a lake in a final attempt at cleansing. Baptize, creep up my throat, above my head, wash away all blood, I'll under, start to swim and water rolling through my hair, scrape me free of, clean now, all the purity I can. These lines show how difficult it can be to express trauma in words. Elaine Scarry argues that, quote, physical pain does not simply resist language, but actively destroys it, bringing about an immediate reversion to a state anterior to language, to the sounds and cries a human makes before language is learned. The sounds emanating from the girl at times indicate a definite return to what Scarry refers to as a state anterior to language. But in the end, through death, she hopes to reconcile herself with her body in a symbolic baptism that might purge her imaginary sins and give her peace. Throughout MacBride's narrative, Catholicism is a source of pain and oppression, its champions bereft of any empathy or forgiveness. One is left with the impression that it would be easier to get spiritual solace outside of the church than within it. Eamon Martin does not provide a more upbeat description of the ills associated with Catholicism. In a self-reflective essay, the writer explained why she is attracted to marginal figures. I'm quoting from Martin. Often my characters are hungry ghosts entangled in a great web of trauma, but soothing and devouring themselves with addiction, as they wait for the spider to come. Her self-declared purpose was to mount a challenge to, quote, the once immutable religious power as defined by my experience being raised in a rigidly Catholic society. She is wary of any group of people, particularly one with a religious agenda, being given unconditional power over society. The problems that arise when this is allowed to happen are powerfully captured in Martin's third novel, The Cruelty Men, published in 2018, which traces the move of a family from the township of Ballinaskelligs in County Kerry to Rathcarn in County Meath. This was part of a policy designed by the government of Ireland shortly after independence, whereby Irish-speaking families like the O'Connells were offered land in Meath in the hope that they might keep the native language alive in that part of the country. The experience of the transplanted O'Connell family in The Cruelty Men emphasises the ultimate failure of such a policy. The eldest child, Mary, acknowledges that she had to give up her native tongue in order to survive in the new free state, and free I have in inverted commas. She and her siblings, quote, had been summoned back to reconquer stolen lands in a newly independent country, but little job we made of it. Instead, we became their servants. We learned their tongue and not they ours. Deprived of both their parents, Mary has the unenviable task of raising her siblings on her own. She lives in daily fear of the cruelty men, government officials, who went around the country searching for children who were not attending school and or whose parents were deemed incapable of looking after their welfare. For a while, she manages to keep the family unit intact, but the task becomes impossible when the eldest son, Seamus, takes control of the farm and the family. The first thing he does is to arrange for his brother Pádraig to be sent to an industrial school, where his strange mannerisms and inability to speak result in his being committed to a psychiatric unit where he dies after receiving several doses of electrotherapy. Martin's clear objective was to expose the brutal regime in some of Ireland's corrective institutions. In an interview with the journal.ie, she explained how she experienced the findings of the Ryan and Murphy reports as the, quote, unfolding of stories. And she continued, it was as if we hadn't heard them before or hadn't been able to listen to them. Suddenly we were listening. In a sense, The Cruelty Men is Martin's way of unravelling an ugly side of Ireland's past. Each of the O'Connell children is allowed to narrate his or her story, and what emerges is an indictment of Irish post-nationalist society, which was characterised by what I refer to as consensual silence. Hear no evil, see no evil. The attractive Maeve, who ends up working in a shop in Trim and is pursued by many men, one of them the son of a wealthy farming family, falls pregnant and ends up in a mother and baby home, then a Magdalen laundry, and finally a mental home, where she suffers the same fate as her brother. The malevolent parish priest, Father Gilligan, irked at the lack of respect she shows him, tells the nuns they will have their work cut out with Maeve, that she almost ruined two decent families with her carry-on. This causes Maeve to observe, always the respectable families, the ones with the money. They were busy trying to separate themselves from the likes of us. The woes of the O'Connell family do not end there. After being unable to prevent her younger brother and sister from departing, Mary too has to leave the family home and ends up as a housekeeper and nanny to a couple, the Lionses, a lawyer and a teacher, who treat her with respect and kindness. The Lionses do not shout at or beat their children and are close friends with the local clergy, especially Father Lavin, whose housekeeper Elizabeth doubles up as his mistress. Elizabeth describes for Mary her experiences in the Magdalen laundry. They drummed into us that we were the spawn of Satan. We were taken because someone ratted to the priest that my mother, who had 13 children, had a boyfriend. She remains bitter about how they were treated. What is my crime, Mary, she asks. I wasn't a bloody orphan. My mother wanted us. They stole her off us. They were waiting outside in a car to take us, the priest and the guards. Once more, there's collusion here between church and state in the incarceration of innocent children. Mary is convinced that the only way to save her youngest brother, Sean, is to get him to join the ranks of the clergy. He enters the novitiate of the Christian Brothers and qualifies as a teacher. He is offered his choice of the best schools, but decides that he wants to work in an industrial school. I feel they need changing and sorting out, he says. I feel my mission would be most fulfilled there, and not among the children of the wealthy and the powerful. These laudable sentiments are not in keeping with the ethos of the principal, Brother Peter, proudly declares how the Catholic Church in Ireland controls, quote, all women, men, boys and girls of every class. The people of Ireland are here, in the palm of our hands. He goes on to describe the inmates in the school as the detritus of our new independent society. Bringing about change in a place so negatively disposed towards the students will clearly be far from easy, and indeed it proves more than Sean can handle. When his own nephew Ignatius, Seamus's son, arrives in the school, he does all in his power to protect him from the more predatory and violent brothers. Ignatius intuits that his uncle endured sexual abuse in the novitiate. Exasperated by his nephew's constant interrogations on this point, Sean administers a fearful beating to Ignatius in full view of the school, an act that earns for him a standing ovation from the brothers. Realizing he is in danger of mimicking what he is trying to change, Sean hangs himself in his room. The O'Connell family are depicted as victims of an unjust and uncaring society, which is primarily interested in keeping the poor in check and using them as a source of free labour. Martin's portrayal of religious figures in the novel is rather one-dimensional. The nuns working in the laundry are uniformly evil and bereft of sympathy for those committed to their care. The brothers are by and large violent and abusive, almost caricatures of what characterised the worst atrocities in the industrial schools. Father Lavin and Sean O'Connell are the only redeeming religious figures in the novel, but they are too weak to change the abuses they see happening in front of their eyes. Maeve is subjected to particularly harsh treatment and eventually feels as though she is going underground, quote, under the thud and hum of the laundries, under the heaps of banned books from exiled scribblers, under the shoeless bloody feet of slave children, in the obscene care of church and state. Uncounted lives melted like snow off a ditch. Martin's position when it comes to the horrors visited on young people as a result of what commentators now agree was a concerted collusion of church and state is unambivalent. Her website acknowledges that her entire body of work was, quote, written in rage, resistance, and rejection of resignation. Resistance is a refusal to accept the condition we find ourselves in. Art can speak to power by subverting the rational and opening up new possibilities. The Cruelty Men is, without a doubt, an angry novel, perhaps too much so. Martin has real gifts as a writer and is especially successful when she does not impose her personal views on the fictional narrative. She explained once that her work is, quote, a call to revolt against this despair through examining the roots of the problem, facing it, protecting Indigenous culture, and rebelling against the authorities who have deemed it convenient to have problematic areas of the population consigned to haunt the fringes of humanity in a fog of poverty, addiction, and inertia. Worthy though these motives are, they suggest an agenda that might not suit the impartiality that we tend to associate with the work of those who are the most highly regarded practitioners of the novelistic genre. Our final writer Claire Keegan has attained canonical status in a relatively short space of time. She came to public attention on the occasion of the publication of her first short story collection, Antarctica, in 1999, which prompted Declan Khyber to describe her as a writer already touched with greatness. Her publications since that time have not been plentiful. Another short story, Walk the Blue Fields, appearing in 2007, and then her novellas, Foster, 2010, and Small Things Like These, 2021. It's this latter work which will form the basis of our discussion in this paper. Keegan's oeuvre exemplifies what could be described as the iceberg effect, by which I mean that although we only get to see what is above the water, in this case words on a page, the massive unseen material under the surface is what makes the work so satisfying and accomplished. Whenever she releases a work for publication, the rigorous edits she has undertaken are felt in the seamless prose and the authenticity of the human situations that are evoked. Her work is published by the renowned Faber and Faber imprint, and their belief in Keegan was rewarded earlier this year when Small Things Like These was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. It didn't win, in fact. The novel recounts the journey that leads Wexford coalman Bill Furlong to pit himself, excuse the pun, against the nuns in the local Good Shepherd convent, one of the most important customers of his most important customers, by taking a girl out of the mother and baby home where she was sent by her family. By dedicating her novel to the women and children who suffered in Ireland's mother and baby homes and Magdalen laundries, Keegan reveals from the outset the main focus of the novel's plot and content. In an interview with The Guardian, however, when asked about why she wrote a novel about the Magdalen laundries, Keegan denied this was her objective, explaining, "I think this is the story of a man with 5 daughters, in a marriage, who's running a coal yard and is probably a workaholic, and may be facing some kind of midlife crisis. I think it's the story about a man who was loved in his youth and can't resist offering the same type of love to somebody else." This is a reasonable assertion, as the novel is more about the main character's awakening to what he sees as his moral duty than it is about the actual happenings inside the mother and baby home. To understand Furlong's act of defiance, it's important to know that his mother became pregnant with him when she was 16, after which the father made a hasty exit. She was working at the time as a domestic for Mrs. Wilson, a Protestant widow who lived in the big house, a short distance outside the town of New Ross. Rather than removing the girl from her position after hearing about the pregnancy, Mrs. Wilson stated that both the mother and child would be most welcome in her house, an example of Christian charity that was not forthcoming from the Catholic community at the time. Bill Furlong therefore had first-hand experience and knowledge of what his mother's fate would have been if it hadn't been for the kindness of Mrs. Wilson. It may well be this fact that prompts him to perform similar gestures of kindness to those in unfortunate circumstances. He regularly gives the son of a local drunkard, Mick Sinnott, the loose change in his pocket, and is moved to tears on seeing a young schoolboy drinking milk out of a cat's bowl behind the priest's house one cold winter's morning. Feeling compassion for the socially deprived is one thing, however, taking up the cudgels for those in the care of the Good Shepherd nuns quite another. Arriving one day before Christmas with a load of timber and coal, he makes his way towards the rear of the convent, where he spots in a small lighted chapel more than a dozen inmates, quote, down on their hands and knees, with tins of old-fashioned lavender polish and rags, polishing their hearts out in circles on the floor. None of them is wearing shoes, and they all look famished with the hunger. One of them glances up at Bill plaintively and asks, "Mister, won't you help us?" Because the image of his mother comes to his mind when he considers the plight of the girls, Bill cannot tolerate them being treated in this way. When he discusses his dilemma with his wife Eileen, she recognizes immediately that no good will come from challenging the authority of the church. If you want to get on in life, she says, there's things you have to ignore so you can keep on. Her pragmatism holds little sway over her husband, especially when he discovers a girl in the convent fuel shed shortly afterwards, still lactating after giving birth to a baby a few months previously and suffering from hypothermia. The traces of excrement on the floor indicate that she has been there for some time. In a subsequent discussion with the Mother Superior, Furlong is told that the other girls must have played a prank on their friend and locked her in the shed, a story that holds no weight in the eyes of the Coma. In the previously cited interview with The Guardian, Keegan was at pains to point out that her desire was not in any way to demonize the nuns, who were, after all, in concert with the state agencies and Irish society in general by behaving as they did. It is interesting that Keegan mentions how she left Ireland to study in America in 1986, the same year as a young teenager, Anne Lovett, died after giving birth in a grotto in the rural town of Granard, County Longford. The incident sparked a stream of testimonies from women who felt the need to share their experience of unplanned pregnancies on the popular Gay Byrne radio show. The symbolism of the young girl breathing her last breath under the watchful eye of the Virgin Mary, the icon of feminine purity, was something that added to the poignancy of the situation. Keegan explained that the memory of Anne Lovett may well have contributed to the tone of her novel, which nonetheless concludes on a strangely upbeat note, as Bill rescues the young girl, Sarah's her name, and walks through the Christmas crowds of New Ross. As they carried along and met other people, Furlong did and didn't know, he found himself asking what was the point in being alive without helping one another. Was it possible to carry on along all through the years, the decades, through an entire life, without once being brave enough to go against what was there and yet call yourself a Christian and face yourself in the mirror? The difference in the message being conveyed here to what we encountered with Eamon Martin is that in this instance, it's consistent with the personality of the main character, through whose eyes the novel is narrated. Having the courage of your convictions, standing up against injustice and oppression, saying and doing things that are not popular, these are the traits that help Furlong to achieve something akin to catharsis at the end of the novel. They are the traits we associate with him throughout. By taking the stance he does, Bill strikes a blow for the victims of a system that allowed young children to be kept in horrible conditions, sometimes tortured, poorly fed, all in the name of a morality that was the antithesis of the example provided by the founder of Christianity. Bill knows there will be consequences for his audacious act, and yet he feels lighter as he makes his way home. The worst was yet to come, he knew. Already he could feel a world of trouble waiting for him behind the next door. But the worst that could have happened was already behind him. The thing not done, which could have been, which he would have had to live with for the rest of his life. Inaction on his part was unconscionable. The fact that the novel ends on a cold Christmas Eve, at a time when people are looking forward to spending time with loved ones, sharing food and presents, and perhaps reflecting on how their lives are different from that night when the Son of God joined the human race in a stable, makes Furlong's act of charity all the more relevant. There is not much discussion of religion in small things like these, apart from the main character's belief in the importance of helping those in need. Had he abandoned Sarah, Bill Furlong's cowardice would have haunted him for the rest of his life. His belief that he and his family would manage is based on his philosophy that good things come from acts of Christian charity. The four women authors discussed in this paper share a concern with the victims of a Catholic society that failed to look after its vulnerable citizens and was more concerned with appearances than with real faith. Sociologist Tom Inglis has often spoken about the moral monopoly enjoyed by the Catholic Church in Ireland during the early and middle decades of the last century, when there was social capital attached to being perceived to be a good Catholic. In more recent times, the spectacular fall from grace of the once all-powerful church institution has meant that religion is becoming increasingly a private affair if it continues to play any meaningful role at all in people's lives. Many commentators argue that modernity brings about secularization by eroding attachment to religious practice and leading to the ultimate death of God. Taylor finds such an argument unconvincing and argues that it fails to take into account the many instances where this process does not, in fact, take place. The women writers dealt with in this paper are more concerned with the trauma visited on their characters in novels that are set for the most part in the 20th century than they are with charting the gradual demise of traditional Irish Catholicism. At this juncture, I think it's useful to return to Anne Enright's The Gathering and the story of Veronica's uncle Brendan, who was committed to St. Ita's mental institution, although he was only suffering from depression. In the view of Valente and Bacchus, Enright employs Brendan to signal, quote, the ethico-political failings of Irish society towards its disabled and disempowered victims, as well as its continued moral default in allowing their systematic erasure from the national story. It seems to me that all four novelists are to varying degrees attempting to highlight the ills that were perpetrated in Ireland under the control of an all-powerful religious, social and political alliance, and to ensure that the victims are not erased from public or private memory. That in itself is a valuable contribution to heightening public awareness of what often lays hidden in the dark recesses of the past. Thank you very much.